Good afternoon. I'll just leave a couple of minutes for people as they're joining the webinar. Okay, I think we're about 15:02. So we'll start while a few other people might join the webinar. Good afternoon to all of you joining us today for the launch of the study Relationships in Transit. My name is Chiara Lucchini, and I'm the Displacement Tracking Metrics Regional Coordinator for IOM, the International Organization for Migration in the Eastern Horn of Africa. I work in the Regional Data Hub unit here at IOM. Now, today's webinar is the first of a series of 4 webinars organized jointly by IOM and the Mixed Migration Center to share and discuss findings from studies and research done in the region. With today's webinar, Relationships in Transit, we wish to open the series by sharing insights on the findings from a unique study on the relationships and perceptions between local communities and migrants along the Eastern Corridor. The study was conducted from the point of view of the local communities in Djibouti and in Hargeisa in the Somaliland region. Additionally, we will reflect on what these findings mean for programming and policy engagement, and how do we move forward from evidence to actual evidence creation to actual implementation. Now, as many of you on this webinar might know, the eastern route between the Horn of Africa and the Gulf states via Yemen is one of the busiest, most complex, most dangerous migratory routes in the world. Mobility in the Horn of Africa through Yemen and the Gulf states continues to be complex, triggered by interconnected crises, including persistent insecurity, conflict, extremely harsh climatic conditions, in addition to socioeconomic drivers, of course. In 2022, we had over 441,000 migratory movements observed along this route, which is a 64% increase from 2021. 89 migrants were declared dead or missing, and almost 2 in 5 of roughly 40,000 children traveling this route was unaccompanied. And the number of children traveling alone doubled between 2021 and 2022. Similarly, the number of female migrants traveling along the eastern route also doubled, and arrivals in Yemen from Djibouti and Somalia have almost tripled from 2021 to 2022, when we had 27,700 arrivals, and then last year, 73,200 arrivals. So a bit less than a year ago, when we had the idea of launching the study with MMC, we were just at the end of the COVID-19 mobility restrictions, which and we were seeing any corridors. Now, during the pandemic, it had become very clear that the socioeconomic strain that the pandemic had on communities had a very strong impact on migrants. So communities that were living in migration transit hotspots were now extremely strained. And so also their capacity to provide food, water, and employment to migrants to continue their journeys was compromised. Now, on top of the pandemic in the region, there was at the time, and still there is, the worst drought we had in the past 40 years, which further strained, of course, local communities' resilience and therefore their own capacity to contribute within their communities. We were seeing instances of local community members referring migrants for assistance, but also hundreds and thousands of stranded migrants that were no longer able to finance their journey by finding work along the way, instances of smugglers that were becoming increasingly aggressive and deceptive to migrants. Local authorities were feeling pressure over increased presence of migrants and limited services. Interviews with migrants showed us consistently that whether the experiences with the local communities were positive or negative, anyways, what was common was the constant tight interaction between migrants and these transit communities. So we know that local communities represent a resource and an essential first line of assistance to migrants in need along the migration journey, but they also have agency in their exploitation and abuse. And so understanding those dynamics became extremely important and a priority for understanding how to design and shape humanitarian and development intervention that are context sensitive. And since 2018, humanitarian and life-saving intervention, as well as transition and development initiatives of government and partners along the Eastern Corridor are coordinated through the Migrant Response Plan for the Horn of Africa and Yemen. Now, this year it is estimated that there will be over 1.4 million people in need, and MRP partners will be targeting roughly 1 million people, 400,000 migrants and 600,000 people from the host community. So today we'll be hearing from two panelists. One is Dr. Ayla Bonfiglio, the regional head of the Mixed Migration Center for Eastern and Southern Africa. Ayla, if you can put on the camera so that people see you, who will tell us about the study and the findings from the study. And on the basis of these findings, we'll take some time to reflect with Coco Haile Gabriel, the head of Project Strengthening IGAD Migration Policies Implementation with GIZ based in Djibouti, on how can we use these findings to actually inform programming and policy. So we will then have 20 minutes for a Q&A session in which we will hear from you what your questions, comments, and considerations are. And we hope to have a very interactive session. Now, before we start, just few housekeeping rules. We have muted and disabled cameras during the presentations, but we invite all participants to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to write and paste your questions as we go. will be monitoring, and please do specify if you're addressing the question to somebody in particular. Otherwise, I'll take the liberty of assigning somebody to respond. During the Q&A session, you will be able to take the floor. Just raise your hand and we will unmute you. Just please introduce yourself and your organization so that we can better position. I will also share the link of the study in this chat, and we are recording this webinar, and the recordings will be available on the regional data hub, the IOM website, but also available on YouTube. So now, without further ado, I will pass the floor over to Ayla. I would like to thank again both Ayla and Coco for being here, and all of you for coming together to discuss relations in transit.
Thank you, Chiara, for the kind introduction. I'm really glad to be here today because, well, first, special thanks to Laura Nistri, who's on the call, because this webinar series is really her brainchild. And it came about out of a desire to convene more discussions around evidence from the region and the implications for that, and feeling like there weren't enough conversations taking place. So really happy to have nearly 70 participants in the room at such short notice. By way of introduction, I think Chiara summarized really well how this research came about from a joint project perspective, and particularly in terms of what DTM was capturing on the ground, but from a 4MI perspective, which is MMC's main data collection project. In 2020, 4MI data collected from Djibouti with refugees and migrants revealed that 99% of the Ethiopians that we were surveying said that they had received assistance, and 98% had received information from local communities. So this is a huge indication of a need to further study some of these interactions and dynamics. If we can go to the next slide, I will briefly present the main research questions that frame this, of how we probe this issue further. So really, we set out to understand what were the economic and sociocultural interactions between local communities and transiting migrants, the role that local communities played in providing information, services, and assistance, their perceptions about the migrants transiting through their areas, and tentatively to explore what opportunities or challenges existed between local communities and transiting migrants, or in their relationships. And so, unlike a lot of the research that we saw coming out of the region, which really focused on the perspective of refugees and migrants vis-a-vis local communities, this was really about zooming in on the perceptions of local communities themselves. Next slide, please. So a bit of framing of why we and where we situated this research. So we carried out data collection in July 2022 in Tajura and Obok in Djibouti, and in Hargeisa in the Somaliland region. So all of these represent key areas of transit, and also where the Danish Refugee Council, which is Mixed Migration Center's parent organization, where we have an operational presence. But they all represent quite different transit contexts. So Obok and Tajura have approximately 20,000 residents each. These are, let's say, official figures. They vary a bit. Obok is a bit smaller. Obok being a key site for coastal departures, at some points outstripping Bosaso in Somalia, and Tajura being a place more where migrants are transiting on the way to Obok. And both of these locations serve as regional capitals. But because the locations are small, we were able to cover most of the neighborhoods in these locations. Hargeisa, on the other hand, also the regional capital of the Somaliland region, significantly larger population of just over 1 million. And it's a place to stop, to wait for funds from family members to afford the next phase of the journey or to work. But given the size of the location, we focused here on 4 neighborhoods with a high migration presence, according to key informant interviews. All this being said about these locations being high transit locations, some key informants suggested that the relative stability of these locations, the higher salaries, played a role sometimes in migrants shifting their intentions or staying for more prolonged periods, or as Chiara mentioned at the outset, COVID-19 leading to unexpected delays in moving onward. If we could move to the next slide. So we used a random walk sampling in identifying migrants. What this meant was that we assigned each enumerator a starting point and a direction, and then they would survey 1 in every 4 people that they encountered, and they would alternate with different sides of the road. And we used a mixed method approach. So the research is largely based on quantitative data collected through surveys with host communities. You can see the table on the screen. I won't go into too much detail, but we complemented this with qualitative data through key informant interviews with local migration actors, but also community leaders themselves. You'll see one thing to point out is differences in gender balances in each location. We can delve into that further in the discussion, but to point out that the sample in Tadjoura was largely women, 68%, where it was only 1/3 in Obok and close to half, 43% in Hargeisa. And a lot of this has to do with the time of day that enumerators went to households, also the seasons, who was home, and so forth. Next slide. Happy to discuss the methodology further in the discussion, but since I have just about 10 more minutes, I'm going to skip to key findings. So the first set of findings have to do with interactions, and really to accurately understand how local communities interacted with transiting migrants and perceived them. We needed to know the intensity of the interactions that took place. And strikingly, 90% of those surveyed local community members interacted with migrants on a daily basis, 10% weekly. It was a slightly smaller percentage in Hargeisa, and this is not surprising given the fact that we're looking at a much larger urban area. So migrants are much more visible in Obok and Tadjoura. And how did they interact? So you can see on the left, 80% approximately of these local community members reported providing free assistance to transiting migrants, followed by commercial and economic interactions, social interactions, providing free information. And just to unpack a little bit what we mean here, free information here refers to information about the journey itself, whether it's what are the different stopping points along the route, how do you get in contact with smugglers, this kind of information. Commercial and economic interactions are really about business exchanges, migrants as clients for goods and services or as workers themselves. Social interactions and cultural interactions are about shared cultural or religious activities, religious practices, or some kind of shared personal interests. But you see here in both places, even though the extents vary, that free assistance really comes out on top. And that, I think another key message is that there are multiple types of interactions taking place. And if we broke down the data by gender in Hargeisa, women were 2 times as often cited social interactions than men. If we could go to the next slide. So as the main type of interaction, we wanted to delve further into what kinds of assistance were local community members providing to transiting migrants. And the most common in all 3 locations were water and food. And in the case of Tadjoura and Obok, we're talking about an overwhelming majority, so 98 or 96% for water, and close to that with food. And it's not far off in Hargeisa either of those who cited providing assistance. It's 89%. And what this tells us, looking through the entire graph, so that local community members are key stakeholders, key migration stakeholders and key providers of assistance, even though we don't typically recognize them as such. We noticed a bit of variation between the different locations in relation to cash, where it was provided more in Hargeisa and hardly in the two locations in Djibouti. And more respondents in Djibouti provided migrants with information about the journey compared to Hargeisa. And this was largely in a book, which makes sense given where it sits as a point of departure and the greater, let's say, smuggling networks that exist there. Next slide. So we also wanted to understand what kinds of information did local community members give to transiting migrants. And here you can see, again, I think a key message is it's multiple kinds of information about the journey, whether it's the conditions that refugees and migrants can expect, conditions at the destination, locations along the route, the duration of the journey, the cost of the journey, how to find a smuggler, safety and security along the journey, where and how to access services. And what this tells us is that local communities can also be targeted for assistance or awareness raising if the aim is to raise awareness among migrants along the eastern route, that local communities should be included in such programming because migrants are going to them and they might perceive them as more trustworthy, because we've in other research found that often migrants perceive NGOs or UN agencies as trying to stop their movement. And when we asked them why did they provide free assistance and information, the responses that we got were varied around a general courtesy to those in need, a custom to help travelers, courtesy towards people in need again. So there was no expectation of remuneration, but more out of a sense that they should be helping transiting migrants. Next slide. We're coming to economic and commercial interactions. And rather than provide you with the exact figures, which you can find in the report, we see most notably that migrants are employed by local communities. So as laborers, as workers, particularly in Tajura, but also in Abok. It was a slightly lower share in Hargeisa. And again, I owe this to the sizes of these different transit communities. Migrants were also clients or buyers of goods and services of local communities. And so they represented an important feature of the market. But migrants also were providers of goods and services in some instances. And very few respondents talked about providing services to facilitate the journeys of migrants. So here we also have a few quotes. I won't read them out, but really elaborating upon how local communities described their economic relationships. We give them work, they work well too. There's this perception that they're good workers or that they take up work or jobs that Djiboutians would not, in the case of Tajura and Abok. When we delved a little bit further into the kinds of work that local communities had migrants carry out, most often it was work in their homes, so suggesting domestic work, but also in their businesses too, which is important to note. Next slide. We can keep going. So the next set of findings is around perceptions. And I think I have three to 5 more minutes. So once we have this context of the scale or the intensity of interactions and the kinds of interactions that take place, it can really better situate what the perceptions are of host communities towards the migrants transiting through their cities, through their localities. And so first we started with trying to understand whether and what were the advantages of transit migration on local communities. So we asked local community members how they saw the advantages of such movement. And they ranged from labor supply to increased demand for products. Some said no advantages, which I think is also notable, cultural exchanges, and others. So we have a restaurant owner in a book saying migration has a huge influence on this city. Remember, a book only has 18,000 known residents. So it's always the migrants who do the work here. So for my restaurant, I almost only work with migrants. And we see here in a book, 63% of respondents said that they saw advantages because of the increased labor supply. And so it makes one wonder how the communities would function if that labor supply did not exist. We can go to the next slide. And here we come to the main disadvantages. I think overall it's important to note that in Djibouti, 44% of respondents reported positive or very positive perception of migrants versus 35% who reported a negative or very negative perception of migrants. It's a bit different in Hargeisa, where we see just 25% reporting a positive or very positive perception versus about half, 51% reporting negative or very negative. But here we see with the data, when we try and delve into the real advantages and disadvantages, that we have the same respondents reporting both advantages and disadvantages and reporting multiple, showing that, I mean, a nuanced picture, that it's not one or the other, but it's quite a constellation. And that actually gives us as practitioners insights into multiple entry points of how we might engage local communities. So some of the main challenges were around the littering of common spaces, harassment for assistance. And what this means is local community members reported migrants asking them for basic needs support and feeling obliged to provide it, but that it was getting to a point where their own resources were strained and they saw it too much. So we see there's a quote to this effect at the bottom about resource scarcity from a community leader in Hargeisa. And also on the graph, we see strain in resources being cited by those in Hargeisa. Increased tension, crime cited to a lesser extent, but still cited. Some cited no disadvantages, and others didn't know or cited other disadvantages not included in the survey. But something to note in the context of Tajura is that some people saw the advantages in quite an unequal way. So except for the smugglers, they saw that their presence as a place of high transit was not beneficial. So people in transit don't buy anything. The smugglers, or those who work for them, the network, they're the ones who earn the money. So we see a mixed constellation because, of course, in previous slides, we see migrants as clients, but it's not the same for everyone, which might suggest that some kind of mapping be done to understand exactly who is benefiting. Next slide. Okay, I'm nearly done here, but just to try and unpack why we're seeing some of the trends that we're seeing. So as Chiara mentioned, since the pandemic, some stakeholders noted that migrants who planned to transit were actually stuck in towns and more reliant on the community for help. And so their relationships have become more strained. But that where we saw more positive relationships, it was because there was some common link between transiting migrants and local communities around religion, languages spoken, gender, and age. And another way where we saw relationships strengthen or let's say more positive ties is when migrants stayed longer. So although on the one hand, you see this tension arising around migrants being stuck and relying on the community for help, at the same time, as they stayed longer, they began to assimilate more, speak the local language, integrate better, and that somehow improved relationships. Next slide. Something that also came out very strongly in the research was the role of NGOs and UN agencies. So looking at what the impact of migration actors were working with migrants on this relationship between local communities and transiting migrants. So in a book where there is an MRC, respondents largely supported a positive or very positive impacts of the relationship. And in Tajura, where there was they didn't perceive actors, they did not perceive an impact, and that was somewhat true for Hargeisa as well, suggesting that that we do see where there is assistance going towards refugees and migrants, particularly migrants, that that some of the burden is taken off of communities, and that this is acknowledged by local community members as being helpful. Next slide. I will stop here, but just to say that that what really comes through strongly is the local community showing solidarity and support for migrants, pointing or reminding us of the responses we got around the duty or customs around helping transiting migrants, how much assistance they provide. They are a key assistance provider, but they can't be taken for granted as a substitute for humanitarian support or aid. And in some places we see challenges expressed by community members with actually absorbing just all of the needs that migrants have in their areas. And a final recommendation is to really consider either city level or area-based approaches and activities to foster more positive interactions. Back over to you, Chiara. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayla. Really, really insightful and interesting presentation. And as you were talking, I was really struck by the fact that transiting migrants actually provide a huge opportunity for communities to engage socially and to help others, which is actually a very important element in, healthy, vibrant and socials in the fabric of healthy societies. And so I think that this can also be an interesting element to be discussed with local authorities, and not just seen as a burden, but also see how how local communities organize around these new dynamics in positive way. The economic way, of course, that's the clear one, but also the social impact. And I'm not excluding also the more negative parts. But now I would like to ask Coco to bring some reflections from these findings, this study that was done. You work with GIZ supporting migration policy implementation in the region on behalf of the Federal Republic of Germany, and you have both experience in programming and policy. So, what are some of your thoughts? What came to your mind when looking at how do we use these findings?
Thank you, Chiara, and thank you, Ayla, for a very insightful and great presentation. Actually, she already said everything. So I think this study very clearly shows us that there's a multiplicity, also Ayla alluded to that, and sometimes also even paradox of perceptions, good as well as bad, within the study areas. Two cities that are not so far enough from each other, like locally in Djibouti, Tajura and Obok, have very different perceptions of some of the things, as well as in Hargeisa, where you had like 4 boroughs, 4 areas that you studied, there's also differences. And for me, that really shows for our programming, planning and approaches, it is extremely important that we do more area-based approaches and also look at very specific features of migrants and the perceptions, as well as for the host communities. So what I see here is that sometimes we feel if we analyze a country that is small like Djibouti, it's enough, but obviously it is not. There are very big differences in some of the solutions that could be proposed. For instance, if you look at, for instance, Obok seeing the additional labor force as a very good and very positive impact on the community. It is the opposite actually in Hargeisa, where there's a bit of worry of competition, and Ethiopians, for instance, having better skills and then maybe being disadvantages for the local community. So this is not always the same place, it's not always the same solution that would work. So I think the study really clearly shows that, and that is very interesting. Also, both Chiara and Ayla pointed out the very strong role of the local community to give assistance. I think that should be embraced for sure. It should also be shown and highlighted as a very great contribution, and also to look at it as positive, as you, Chiara, also said, framing it in a more positive way as well. But at the same time, of course, shouldn't rely only on the local community. So I think where a big role for everyone would come in is also to support local governments to be much stronger in planning for migrants. I mean, it's a fact. It's we can do whatever we want. They will be there. They will be using or needing assistance, and we cannot necessarily, leave it all to the local community. There's also some things that might not be addressed that would be very necessary, that need more, more sort of professional support, like let's say psychosocial support and such things. So those would be gaps that cannot be filled by the local community per se. So in that sense, I think one point in one area where there's there's strong need, I would say, is to strengthen actually the local governments also to anticipate, to plan, and to include. In the refugee rooms, we do that. We talk about inclusion very much. So I think in this sense, I think that would be really, really important, and something that I would also take out as a takeaway for this study. And I see also that, the shifting of financing along the routes, so the Eastern route is not so much of a priority currently when it comes to international financing. That could actually mean that in future there'd be even more strain on the local community to respond. So I think this is something that needs to be addressed, and where local governments should also have a role. There can also be a role. They could also have a role for gathering more information, etc., in regards to civil registry, etc., things like that. Also things that the regional center of IOM is also supporting very much in the IGAD region. So it would be also great if this could come together. I also see that these cohesive factors, like the economic interactions, those are very important interactions, and I think we should have some way of harnessing those better, where it makes sense and where it is really also a possibility. I think there's this transient issue where transiting through Djibouti or transiting through Somaliland becomes migrating there, and then of course there's some of the factors that become, as you said, also less risk, let's say less negatively perceived, because then there's integration and there's languages learned and so on, cultural and so on. But I think there needs to be some sort of what do you say? Focus a little bit on what are the positive and economic, let's say the connectors. And I see also that in the sense that the differences in the communities that were looked at also shows that you have to have the local context for it. I know it's not nothing new, but sometimes we still forget about the specificities of a local context. And I think also some of the things that were put there as risks, like negatively perceived, like littering and especially health risks, there should also maybe, if there's a possibility to look at it from a way that you could use those. We in Moyale, on the border between Ethiopia and Kenya, we also actually did a cohesive action on such things like waste management, where the community did these things together. So there is possibilities to look at those factors and also try and change them into something that would be also perceived more positive. So my question really also is to this study, and my reflections was like the difference between transiting. You have the active transition in Obok, where people are moving quickly, leaving, and then where in Tajora and in Hargeisa, where this can become a longer stay. And as of course the study was focusing on the transit, I still wonder how we can link this more also to those who are resident then. What are the possibilities for regularization? In Djibouti, of course, it is possible to regularize. It's just often not done. So the question is, what kind of advocacy, what kind of work can be done with also the community to convince that those who are staying longer, maybe you try and regularize them. I'm not so familiar with the situation in Somaliland on that one. So I think also when it comes to the information, I was actually going to ask Chiara, or actually Ayla, when it comes to the information that was shared, or is it because all of them said for the because of nicety, because they need someone to be informed, etc. But it could also be actually like, the question is, what kind of information are they passing on? I mean, is it, if I'm a smuggler, my interest could be telling you, actually, it's super easy, huh? You just go, there's no risk. Could be an information that I pass on, right? So I really think it would be quite important to really work also with the community, the local community, if this is something that they're doing a lot, to really try and get the quality, the quality and let's say the truthfulness also of the information to the local community. I'm sure there's some that the local community has much better information than what local NGOs or so would have. But on the other hand, I think there's always a risk that you would also use your position of knowing something where somebody knows nothing on the other side, or little, to maybe not necessarily pass on the right information. So in that sense, I would say I would really love these kind of studies to be done more often, because of the differences that it shows. It doesn't really, reading through it, I was also telling you earlier, reading through it, you think like, oh, is this redundant? But no, it's actually not. It's the same topic in another country, another setting, but you can see that it is not always automatically, perceived the same way. So I think those are the ones, the issues, the differences that we need to actually understand for the context to have very tailor-made responses. And also looking at how to, work with local communities, but not overburden them, work with local governments, but maybe just to make sure that in a way that it will be sustainable, they can plan effectively for some things, and they can be prepared for some, because I think in Djibouti currently it's even more people passing through than were at the time of the study. So I think this is what my takeaway is. It's a good exercise. It would also be great to see in which way, let's say, also even data and information can come also from local government and whatever civil registry, etc. we have available, so that it also becomes something that would be also owned and used by local governments. That's yes. I think I'll stop there. Because also Ayla actually already put most of the points out there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Coco. Indeed, let's leave some time for the Q&A, but I found extremely interesting the observation on the local authorities. So before, we already received a few questions, but to give time to those who are online in case they want to take the floor, or if more people want to write questions in the chat. I think the point on local authorities and engaging them with the results from these studies to be able to plan for these type of dynamics, which we did the study now, but migration through these towns is not new at all. And so this is I think local authorities are extremely eager to engage, because they're at the forefront of the problem as they mostly see it. And so being able to show the different facets of it, and these type of studies, I think, also help us to better understand the local communities that sometimes we tend to put in the background, while providing the local authorities with some data and tools to advocate, because that, you know, data is needed for them to plan and to advocate with the central government. So in this sense, I think the next step that would be very interesting to continue will be engaging with the local authorities in Tajura, in Hargeisa, in Obok, to see what their thoughts are on these findings and how we can use them to plan and improve things there, but also to bring them up and have them bring it up at national level. And on the issue of regularization of migrants, also quite interesting, because recently we were doing some also qualitative studies in the south of Djibouti, and quite a number of migrants were interested in claiming asylum, because their understanding was that that was the only way to get regularized in the country, in Djibouti in this case. And so the importance of, again, explaining what are the immigration rules, what are the opportunities, and working at the same time with the authorities to enlarge perhaps those opportunities for regular migration that don't necessarily have to go into, you know, international protection mechanism, if that's not the case. All right, so I don't see new questions, but perhaps we can start with a couple of questions that have come through the chat. Let me just pull them up. So we have a first, I won't respect the order necessarily, but one was directly on Ayla's presentation, and it came from Fenet, asking which kind of migrants are you looking at in the study? Are they displaced, refugees, or economic migrants? Can you observe the interaction with community for different migrant groups? So are the interactions with the community different according to differences within the migrant groups? So perhaps I'll pass this question to Ayla, but I'll just respond to part of the question, which is we have quite by now a rich body of work on migrants. And so the interest here was not focusing on migrants, but rather really looking at the transit communities. However, I'm sure that Ayla has some points about the different groups of migrants, if this has emerged while working with the local communities. Over to you, Ayla.
Thanks, Chiara. So our questions really centered around, and I think this is section 4 of the report, how do local communities actually perceive the people transiting their localities, and overwhelmingly they recognize them as Ethiopians. They identified some key regions of origin within Ethiopia that largely align with a lot of the flow monitoring data that we have from IOM. We did not ask them whether they perceived them as refugees or migrants, but we asked them about their knowledge of the reasons for their movement. And so they recognize these more economic factors driving their movements, but also conflict and violence, climate, personal or family reasons. And so you see that, yeah, the mixed nature of movements come through really, really strongly, but nevertheless, the corridor is largely a labor corridor. It's a corridor on which people express, let's say, economic drivers the most, but that doesn't mean that they don't also experience other drivers as well. Over.
And maybe interesting on this point is that, and this didn't come from this study, but interviewing migrants repeatedly with women, in Obok and, well, let's start with the Obok. In Obok, a number of women said that the host community, the local communities were more understanding towards them and more willing to support. Now, migration is mostly young men and boys that make up roughly 3/4 of the migrants transiting, for example, through Djibouti. And so there was a tendency to support more women, providing them access to water, clothes, and whatnot. The other interesting thing was in the south of the country, looking at different types of migrants from the Somali region in Ethiopia, or migrants coming from Oromia region. The local community there is of Somali origin in the southern of Djibouti. And this had a huge impact on the willingness of the local community to assist and support and to consider these migrants transiting or remaining for medium term as almost part of the community. So that was, I think, an interesting point. Then we have a question, interesting question from Paulo Roja Trinidade from the European Committee of the Regions. And perhaps for this, I'd like to call online Laura, the Regional Data Hub Coordinator for IOM, as the question is about, is there any innovative action co-designed in countries of origin to avoid tragedies such as the recently occurred one in Italy? So are we doing studies with the local governments in countries of origin? Over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, and thank you all panelists for their presentation and reflections. And that is a very difficult, meaning very large type of question, you know, that can require more than a webinar itself to be addressed. We know from research along the Eastern Corridor that the main drivers of migration are largely economic, but related to lack of access to resources, land degradation, unemployment, and these are the main drivers. And that there are very well-established network migration between origin and destination in Saudi Arabia, as well as actors, smugglers, and different facilitators. So what we have seen that migrants, although knowing the risk that this migration can entail in terms of the crossing, you know, as you said, the throwing of the boat, you know, the capsizing, or then even to crossing Yemen, even the knowledge of this risk, although not always very solid knowledge, we can say, but anyway, that would not stop them to still trying to, they say, you know, to change my life or to have more opportunities for them and their families at home through remittances and what they can do. So the root causes and how to tackle them, this is very complex discussion or topics. Overall, I can make just suggest, make reference to some interventions that they were made. For instance, IOM together with the European Union, there was the EU-IOM joint initiative and all the sustainable reintegration approach, where they were trying to have a more holistic approach to support the migrants to reintegrate, so that in order to avoid the impact of remigration, so then, you know, so therefore to have a more sustainable process in terms of the economic, the social, and the psychological component of their integration. Otherwise, what we always promote or try to advocate, it is just to enlarge or to extend regular pathways to migration. Because if more venues would be available and accessible and available, we most likely more migrants will use quick recourse or try to use them rather than irregular means of and risk. And finally, of course, job creation programming. We know that most of the population migrating, above 90% are Ethiopians. So any large-scale job creation activities, job creation plans and intervention led by the government would be one of the most successful. And some are in places, but as we can say, the drivers are very strong. And also migration as a livelihood opportunities, as a way to differentiate income at home. These are all very strong push. Yeah, not a reply, but maybe some reflection. But thank you so much for this.
Sorry, I was having issues unmuting myself. Thank you, Laura. Meanwhile, we had another question in the chat from Hassan. In defining of transit migration, which factors do you include in the research? So I guess the question is about how did we define this to be a transit migration? Is it on the basis of time, on the basis of status, and so on? I am happy to. Ayla, do you want to take this?
Sure, it's pretty quick. We didn't have an extensive theoretical framework as such, but key that respondents cited an intended destination that was not the destination. Sorry, that was not the destination that they were currently in. But respondents, not for this study, but let's say more generally in how we would view it, it's not often a cited destination, and that migrants would typically spend. This is now from an MMC perspective, right? Because for this study, we did not interview migrants, we interviewed local communities, but it would be 2 years or less in an effort to capture people actively on the move. And this is not a definition, but this is like, what kind of framework do we use to capture people who are actively in transit? So looking at those who have not been settled for longer protracted periods of time, and looking at people who cite an intended destination that's different from the location that they're currently in. Chiara, maybe you want to also add from a DTM perspective.
Sure, indeed, we had identified these locations because these are the ones that typically we observe through flow monitoring that people don't have that place, don't have that country as destination country. In Obok, it's very visual. You see people on the beach ready to leave, or in Fontejero ready to leave, and one day they're there, the next day they're no longer there. Tajura is also a place of transit. Hargeisa, we had picked it because it's a bit more mixed in the sense where we have both. It's a place where definitely the majority of people that also leave from Bosaso have come in through, but also a place where there is the town offers enough for let's say migrants to stay longer time, or for migrant families also to stay for longer periods of time. And so we wanted to observe this, but we did not want to conduct the study, for example, in Djibouti, where we know that there are quite significant numbers of migrants that stay there with the aim of working and spending a year or more in that location. So I hope that answers. Now we are at the end. We have 1 more minute, and there is a question from Beatrice. Is there any social integration program of migrants which is provided by the hosting government? I don't know if any of the panelists have knowledge of this. Personally, I don't, for Djibouti and Somaliland region, but we can check. Somebody has its hand up. Hassan, Let's see. I'm not sure I can unmute Hassan.
Hassan also asked us about the transit migrant question, so maybe it was the same.
Okay, so maybe it's the same. Yeah. Okay. If there are no more questions, we have gotten to the end of the webinar. So I would like to thank all of you for being online, for being active with questions, and a huge thanks to Laura for organizing this series, and to Ayla for the fantastic collaboration on the study, and Coco for the insightful reflections, and overall the opportunity to discuss with different profiles about research and how to use research for programming and policy. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Chiara, also. Bye, everyone.
Chiara for the moderation, and thank you, everyone.
Yes, for the moderation.
Ciao.
Laura. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.